Have you ever known, deep in your gut, that you were right, even when every voice of authority? She was a function, a pair of eyes assigned to the secondary sensor arrays, a small, unassuming figure in a crisp but ill-fitting uniform, tucked away in a corner alcove where the main view screen was just a peripheral glare. Her station was a monument to obsolescence, a place for rookies to cut their teeth on meaningless data streams before graduating to more important roles. But Alara never graduated. For 2 years, she had remained in that corner, her presence as consistent and as overlooked as the low hum of the ship's life support. She came from a dustball colony on the fringe of the outer rim, a place where you learn to read the shifting sands before you learn to read a data slate. She had earned her place at the academy through sheer, grit-toothed determination, but her background clung to her like a shadow, marking her as an outsider among the polished scions of core world dynasties. Commander Liam Thorne, the ship's first officer and chief of tactical, was one such scion. He moved with the unthinking confidence of a man who had never been told no, his uniform perfectly tailored, his jaw perpetually set in a look of mild disdain for the universe's general imperfection. To him, Alara Vance was a piece of equipment, and a minor one at that. He never used her name, referring to her only as Sensors or the ensign in the corner. He believed in the sanctity of the chain of command, a rigid structure that had placed him near the top and her at the very bottom. Protocol was his religion, and he was its most fervent disciple. At the center of this universe was Captain Eva Rostova. Her name was a legend in the fleet, a commander who had stared down Klingon battlecruisers and navigated plasma storms that had swallowed lesser ships whole. But the weight of command was a heavy cloak. For 6 weeks, the Odyssey had been hunting the Wraith, a pirate vessel captained by a ghost who struck merchant convoys with impunity and vanished before the fleet could respond. The Admiralty was breathing down Rostova's neck. The pressure was immense, etched in the fine lines around her eyes and the weary set of her shoulders. She trusted her crew, trusted her first officer, but their hunt had been a string of frustrating failures. The Wraith was more than a ship, it was a phantom, always one step ahead. Today, however, felt different. They had tracked the Wraith to the Charybdis Nebula, a treacherous graveyard of asteroids and gravitational anomalies. It was a place where ships went to die. According to Commander Thorne's triumphant declaration, the Wraith was finally trapped. He stood before the main view screen, a confident smirk playing on his lips as he outlined his strategy. The pirate is pinned against the grav-well of that proto-star, he announced, his voice echoing with self-satisfaction. We will execute a standard pincer maneuver. Phalanx formation. We'll squeeze them until they have nowhere left to run. The bridge officers nodded in assent, their faces reflecting Thorne's confidence. It was a textbook maneuver, clean and decisive. But in her forgotten corner, Alara Vance felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Her screen was a cascade of complex data, gravimetric distortions, energy signatures, subspace resonance echoes. It was noise to most people. But to Alara, who had learned to see patterns in the chaos of a sandstorm, it was a language. And it was telling her a story that was terrifyingly different from the one Commander Thorne was narrating. She saw not a cornered animal, but a patient predator. The energy readings from the asteroids weren't passive, they were expectant. The drift patterns weren't random, they were a carefully constructed web. The Wraith wasn't trapped. It was waiting. It was luring them into the perfect kill box. Part 1, 845 words. Alara's fingers danced across her console, her movements fluid and certain. She ran a diagnostic, then a second, then a third. The results were the same each time, a stark, undeniable truth screaming from the lines of code and energy waves. The asteroids weren't just rocks. They were laced with something artificial, a network of kinetic energy charges linked to proximity triggers. The Wraith hadn't been fleeing into the nebula for safety, it had been seeding its own battlefield. The pincer maneuver Thorne proposed would force the Odyssey directly into the densest part of that prearranged minefield. The pirates wouldn't need to fire a single shot. The Odyssey would tear itself apart on the rocks. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Protocol demanded she report her findings through her direct superior, a lieutenant who rarely even glanced in her direction. That report would then be filtered up to Thorne, who would likely dismiss it as rookie jitters without a second thought. There wasn't time. The orders were being given. The helmsman's hands were already on the controls, ready to guide the massive starship into the jaws of the trap. The blood rushed in her ears, a roaring torrent that drowned out the calm, professional chatter on the bridge. She saw the faces of the crew, confident and oblivious. She saw Captain Rostova, her gaze fixed on the view screen, trusting her first officer completely. The weight of their lives, of the entire ship, suddenly felt as if it were resting on her shoulders alone. She had spent 2 years making herself small, making herself invisible, learning that her voice was an unwelcome disruption to the smooth machinery of command. But the sand readers of her homeworld had a saying, "The silent watcher sees the coming storm, but the fool who does not speak is the first to be swept away." She stood up. The simple act felt like a monumental rebellion. The sound of her chair scraping against the deck plating was unnervingly loud in the focused hush of the bridge. Every head turned. For the first time in 2 years, Ilara Vance had the full, undivided attention of the command crew. Commander Thorne paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowing in annoyance. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his tone laced with ice. Ilara's throat was dry. She took a step forward, out of the shadows of her alcove, and into the main light of the bridge. "Commander," she began, her voice steadier than she expected, "with all due respect, your tactical plan is flawed." A collective intake of breath seemed to suck the air from the room. A junior officer, a no-name from a forgotten post, was publicly contradicting the first officer. It was unthinkable. Thorne's annoyance hardened into a glare of pure fury. "Explain yourself," he clipped out, each word a shard of glass. Ilara pointed towards her own screen, though she knew he wouldn't look. "The asteroids, sir. They're not inert. They're rigged. The Wraith has seeded this entire sector with kinetic mines. Your pincer formation will fly us directly into the activation zone. They're not running from us. They're luring us in." She spoke with a desperate urgency, the words tumbling out of her, backed by the undeniable certainty of her data. For a moment, a flicker of something, perhaps doubt, crossed Thorne's face. But it was immediately replaced by the rigid mask of authority. To accept her claim would be to admit his own oversight, his own failure. In his world, that was a weakness far more dangerous than any pirate trap. He held up a hand, silencing her. "Officer," he said, his voice dangerously low, "you are a sensor technician. Your job is to report data, not to interpret it. You are most certainly not in a position to question my tactical decisions." He took a step towards her, his physical presence imposing. "You are overstepping your station. Perhaps the solitude of your post has given you delusions of grandeur." The insult was designed to sting, to put her back in her place. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. They were witnesses to a public dressing down, a harsh but necessary reinforcement of the hierarchy that governed their lives. Ilara held her ground. "Sir, the data is unequivocal. I can show you the resonance patterns. I have seen all the data I need to see," Thorne snapped, his voice rising. "I see a pirate ship that is cornered and a junior officer who has forgotten her place. Now, return to your station, and do not speak again unless you are spoken to." "That is a direct order." His eyes were cold steel. There was no room for appeal. Captain Rostova had watched the entire exchange from her command chair, her expression unreadable. She had remained silent, a silent arbiter. Her lack of intervention was a tacit endorsement of Thorne's authority. The chain of command had to be respected. Ilara felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had tried. She had broken the rules, risked her career, and for what? To be shut down, humiliated. With leaden feet, she turned and walked back to her alcove, the weight of every gaze on the bridge pressing down on her back. She sat at her console, her own reflection staring back from the dark screen, a pale, defeated ghost. The order was given. The Odyssey began to move, gliding majestically, inexorably, into the heart of the trap. Part 2, 863 words. The humiliation was a physical thing, a burning heat that spread from Alara's neck to her cheeks. She kept her eyes locked on her screen, unable to face the pitying or scornful glances she could feel from across the bridge. She had gambled everything on the truth of her data, and she had lost. Commander Thorne, his authority reasserted, moved with renewed confidence. Helm, increase speed to 1/4 impulse. Bring us into optimal firing range. Shields to full power. Arm all forward phaser banks. His voice was crisp, professional, betraying no sign of the confrontation that had just occurred. He was back in his element, executing a plan he believed to be flawless. Captain Rostova, however, was not as settled. From her chair, she watched the main view screen, where the dense field of asteroids grew larger, looming like silent, gray titans. Thorne's public rebuke of Vance had been necessary to maintain discipline, but the young officer's certainty had been unsettling. It wasn't the panic of a rookie, it had been the cold, hard conviction of an expert. Rostova subtly angled her command console's display to mirror the secondary sensor feed from Vance's station. A flood of raw data filled her screen, chaotic and seemingly meaningless. But Rostova hadn't become a captain by only reading summaries. She forced herself to look deeper, to see what the young officer might have seen. She saw the minute energy fluctuations, the odd gravimetric echoes that didn't quite align with natural phenomena. It was strange, indeterminate but not dismissible. A seed of doubt was planted in her mind. Was Thorne's confidence blinding him? Was her own reliance on her first officer creating a fatal blind spot? But it was too late to reverse course without completely undermining her command structure. She had to trust the officer she had chosen as her second. She had to believe in the system. On the screen, the Odyssey slid gracefully between the first few massive asteroids. For a moment, everything was quiet. The bridge was filled with a tense anticipation. Thorne allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. He glanced back towards Alara's alcove, a look of pure, vindictive satisfaction on his face. He had been right. The rookie had been hysterical. Then, the universe erupted in silent, blinding fury. An asteroid to the port side, one they had passed seconds earlier, suddenly glowed with an intense inner light before detonating. The force of the kinetic blast was immense, a physical shockwave that slammed into the Odyssey's shields. The ship shuddered violently, and the lights on the bridge flickered and died for a terrifying second before the emergency backups kicked in, casting the room in a hellish red glow. Report. Rostova's voice cut through the rising panic like a knife. Shields at 80%, came the call from engineering. We've been hit by a kinetic blast. Proximity trigger. Before anyone could process the information, another asteroid exploded, then another and another. Thorne's perfectly planned pincer movement had herded them into the epicenter of a chain reaction. The explosions were not random. They were a choreographed sequence of destruction, pushing the Odyssey, boxing it in, shearing away its defenses with brutal efficiency. It's a trap, the navigator shouted, stating the terrifyingly obvious. The bridge was a cacophony of alarms and damage reports. Shields at 60% and falling. Starboard nacelle is offline. We've lost primary sensors. Commander Thorne stood frozen in front of the view screen, his face pale with shock. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of horrified disbelief. This was impossible. His plan had been perfect. The data had been clear. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding Alara in her corner. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on her console, her expression one of grim, heartbreaking vindication. She had been right. And he, in his arrogance, had led them all into disaster. The wraith, the phantom they had been hunting, finally revealed itself. It decloaked from behind the shadow of the largest asteroid, its sleek, predatory form a dark slash against the fiery backdrop of the explosions. It was exactly where the chain reaction had forced them to be, exposed, damaged, and perfectly positioned for a killing blow. Plasma torpedoes launched from the pirate ship, streaking towards the wounded Odyssey. Evasive maneuvers. Thorn finally roared, his voice cracking with desperation. Fire all phasers. But his commands were too little, too late. He was reacting, not commanding. His composure, the very foundation of his authority, had shattered. The ship groaned as the torpedoes impacted, the remaining shields flaring and collapsing under the onslaught. The deck buckled, throwing crew members from their stations. Sparks rained down from the ceiling. The Odyssey was dying, and it was his fault. In that moment of absolute chaos, Thorn understood the catastrophic depth of his failure. He had prioritized his own pride over the safety of his ship. He had silenced the one voice that could have saved them, all to protect an ego that now seemed laughably small and fragile. He had told her to stand down, and in doing so, he had sentenced them all to death. The red emergency lights bathed his face, illuminating the stark, unforgiving truth of his error. Part 3, 881 words. The ship screamed around them. It was a symphony of destruction, the shriek of tearing metal, the concussive boom of internal explosions, the ceaseless, wailing cry of the emergency alarms. On the bridge, the disciplined crew of the Starship Odyssey devolved into a frantic scramble for survival. Smoke, thick and acrid, began to pour from a ruptured conduit near the engineering station, making eyes water and throats burn. A young ensign at communications slumped over his console, a casualty of a power surge that had turned his station into an electrical death trap. Fear, a raw and primal emotion that protocol and training were meant to suppress, was now a palpable presence in the room. Commander Thorn, once the epitome of control, was now a study in paralysis. He stared at the main view screen, where the Wraith was gracefully maneuvering for another attack run, its movements fluid and predatory. He barked out orders, but they were disjointed, contradictory. Rear out power to forward shields. No, aft shields. Fire a full spread of torpedoes. Belay that, hold your fire. He was a man drowning, flailing wildly as the currents of his own failure pulled him under. His authority had evaporated, replaced by a desperate, panicked energy that only sowed more confusion among the already terrified crew. Captain Rostova saw it all. She saw the fear in her crew's eyes, the smoke filling her bridge, and the utter breakdown of her first officer. In the heart of the storm, she became the calm. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the noise with absolute, unshakable authority. Commander Thorn, relieve yourself of tactical command, she stated, her words leaving no room for argument. Helm, get us behind that class for asteroid, now. Communications, send a ship-wide alert, brace for impact. Engineering, I need everything you have in the aft shields. Give me damage control reports prioritized by deck. Her orders were clear, concise, and immediate. The crew, desperate for leadership, latched onto her words. The helmsman, his knuckles white, wrestled with the controls, trying to coax a response from the battered ship. The communications officer, shakily pushing his fallen comrade aside, began broadcasting the captain's warning. A semblance of order began to re-emerge from the chaos, a testament to Rostova's iron will. But she knew it was a temporary reprieve. The Wraith was toying with them. It was using the debris from the exploding asteroids as a screen, making it impossible to get a clean target lock. Every time they thought they had a bead on the pirate vessel, it would vanish behind a cloud of rock and dust, only to reappear in a new, unexpected location to pepper them with weapon fire. The Odyssey was a wounded giant, a behemoth being slowly bled out by a swift and cunning predator. Rostova's mind raced, cycling through every tactical manual, every battle simulation she had ever studied. Nothing fit. Standard fleet doctrine was useless in this chaotic, three-dimensional hellscape. They were fighting in a graveyard, and the ghosts were winning. Her gaze fell upon Alara Vance. The young officer was still at her station, a small island of intense focus in a sea of panic. Her hands were a blur on her console, not in a frenzy, but with a deliberate, focused speed. She wasn't just monitoring the chaos, she was dissecting it, analyzing it, searching for its hidden grammar. While everyone else saw random explosions and debris, Elara was seeing the underlying physics, the invisible lines of force and momentum that governed the maelstrom. She saw that the Wraith wasn't just using the debris for cover. It was using the gravitational pull of the larger, intact asteroids to perform incredibly tight, high-speed turns, slingshot maneuvers that a ship of its size should not have been able to execute. It was a pattern, a beautiful and deadly dance. And in any dance, once you learned the steps, you could predict the next move. An idea began to form in Elara's mind, a thought so audacious, so contrary to every principle of tactical engagement, that it felt like madness. They couldn't target the ship directly. The debris made that impossible. The conventional approach was failing. But what if they didn't aim at where the ship was? What if they aimed at where it was going to be? It would require a calculation of impossible complexity, factoring in the Wraith's velocity, the gravitational pull of multiple asteroids, and the precise timing of its emergence from behind the debris cloud. It would require a single, perfectly timed, perfectly aimed shot. A shot that would have to be ricocheted, bent around an obstacle to strike a target that was, for all intents and purposes, invisible. A one-in-a-million shot. A fool's hope. But it was the only hope they had left. The Odyssey shuddered again as another volley of plasma fire struck its unshielded hull. The lights flickered more violently this time, and the metallic groan of stressed support beams echoed through the bridge. They were running out of time. The ship was being torn apart, piece by piece. The desperation that had been a flicker in Captain Rostova's eyes now grew into a steady flame. She needed a miracle. She needed a new idea, a new perspective. Her gaze returned to the junior officer in the corner, the one whose warning had been so arrogantly dismissed, the one who was now the only person on the bridge who did not look afraid, but looked focused. The system had failed her. Her first officer had failed her. Protocol had led them into this death trap. Perhaps it was time to listen to the one voice that had defied it all. Part 4, 889 words. The decision solidified in Elara's mind, not as a choice but as an imperative. To remain silent now would be the true act of cowardice. She stood up from her console for the second time, but this time was different. There was no hesitation, no fear-laced uncertainty. Her movements were sharp, deliberate. She strode from her alcove, her path taking her not towards the command chair, but directly to the central tactical station, the nerve center of the ship's combat operations. The officer currently at the station, a young lieutenant whose face was slick with sweat, looked up at her approach, his eyes wide with confusion. Elara didn't wait for permission. She didn't ask. "I need your station," she said, her voice low but carrying an undeniable weight of authority she did not officially possess. The lieutenant was too stunned to argue, and he numbly stepped aside as Elara's fingers descended upon the holographic controls. Commander Thorne, who had been standing by the captain's chair in a state of shell-shock shame, snapped back to life at the sight of this breach of protocol. The last vestiges of his broken authority surged forward in a wave of pure fury. "Vance," he roared, his voice cracking. "I gave you a direct order. You are relieved of duty. Security." He gestured wildly towards the two guards by the bridge entrance. "Security, escort this officer to the brig, now." The security officers started forward, their hands on their sidearms, their expressions grim. They were following orders, maintaining the discipline that was the bedrock of their service. The bridge crew watched, frozen, as the drama unfolded. This was more than insubordination, it was a mutiny of one. But before the guards could reach her, Captain Rostova's voice cut through the tension like a physical blow. "Hold!" It was a single word, spoken without inflection, yet it stopped every person on the bridge cold. The security guards froze mid-step. Thorne turned to his captain, his face a mask of disbelief. "Captain, she is defying a direct order during a combat situation." She is the only one who saw this coming, Liam," Rostova interrupted, her voice quiet but firm. She rose from her command chair and walked to the tactical station, her eyes never leaving Elara's face. She saw no madness, no ego. She saw only a terrifying, brilliant clarity. "You were wrong," she said to Thorn, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. Then she turned her full attention to Alara. "Report, officer. What do you see?" The bridge fell into a profound silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic ping of a hull breach alarm. Every eye was on Alara Vance, the ghost from the corner, who now stood at the heart of their potential salvation. Alara never looked up from the console. Her fingers continued to move, inputting commands, running simulations, her mind working at a speed that seemed almost inhuman. "The Wraith isn't moving randomly, Captain," she began, her voice a steady, focused torrent of information. "It's using the gravitational fields of the larger asteroids to slingshot. It allows for instantaneous changes in vector and velocity that our targeting computers can't track. It's why we can't get a lock." She brought up a new display, a complex web of intersecting lines and arcs overlaid on the tactical map of the asteroid field. "But the path isn't random. It's a repeating pattern. A figure-8 maneuver on a three-dimensional plane. He's using these two primary asteroids as his pivot points." She highlighted two massive chunks of rock on the display. "He's about to begin his next pass. He'll use the debris from our last hit as cover, slingshot around asteroid Beta 7, and emerge here." She placed a blinking red cursor in a patch of empty space, to fire on our exposed engine section. "It will be the killing blow," Thorn scoffed, a bitter, desperate sound. "That's insane. You can't predict a pirate's move with that level of certainty." "It's a guess, a wild gamble." "It's not a guess, Commander," Alara replied, her voice still calm, still focused on her work. "It's physics. He has to obey the laws of gravity, just like we do. His pattern is dictated by the mass of those asteroids." She finally looked up, her gaze meeting Captain Rostova's directly. "Captain, we cannot get a direct lock. But we don't need one. We can fire a single, high-yield phaser burst, calibrated to ricochet off the magnetic field of asteroid Alpha 4. The beam will bend around the debris cloud and intercept that exact point in space." She tapped the red cursor again, at the precise moment the Wraith emerges from its turn. "It will strike their engine core before their pilot can even react." The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. It was a cosmic trick shot, a maneuver so complex, and with such a minuscule margin for error that it belonged in a theoretical physics textbook, not a battlefield. Thorn threw his hands up in exasperation. "Captain, this is madness. We have barely enough power for one more full phaser discharge. Wasting it on this fantasy will leave us completely defenseless. It is a violation of every tactical doctrine in the book." "The book has failed us, Commander," Rostova said, her voice cold. She studied Alara, seeing the unwavering conviction in her eyes. It was the same conviction she had seen earlier, the conviction she had allowed her first officer to silence. She would not make that mistake again. The ship rocked again from a minor impact. The hull breach alarm grew more insistent. On the tactical display, the faint energy signature of the Wraith began its deadly arc behind the debris cloud, exactly as Alara had predicted. They had seconds left. Part 5, 911 words. The moment hung suspended in time, a fragile bubble of silence amidst the roaring chaos. The fate of the Odyssey and its 400 souls balanced on a knife's edge, and the decision rested solely with Captain Eva Rostova. She looked at Commander Thorn, his face flushed with a mixture of righteous indignation and fear. He represented everything she had ever known and trusted, the rules, the hierarchy, the established doctrines that had guided her career and kept her crews safe for decades. His argument was logical, sound, and rooted in centuries of military tradition. Firing their last significant energy reserves on a speculative, ricochet shot was, by all accounts, an act of unforgivable recklessness. Then she looked at Alara Vance. The young officer stood at the tactical console, her posture radiating an almost supernatural calm. She was not arguing or pleading. She was simply presenting the truth as she saw it, a truth derived not from a rulebook, but from the fundamental language of the universe, mathematics, physics, and a profound, intuitive understanding of the patterns hidden within chaos. In Alara's eyes, Rostova saw not recklessness, but a diamond-hard certainty. It was the look of a master artisan, who knows exactly where to strike the stone to reveal the gem within. The ship's internal communications channel crackled in Rostova's ear. "Captain," came the strained voice of her chief engineer, "the containment field for the warp core is fluctuating. Another direct hit to the engine section, and I can't guarantee it won't breach. We have maybe 30 seconds, 30 seconds. The bubble of time popped. On the main view screen, a proximity alert flashed. The Wraith was beginning its final attack run, still cloaked by the cloud of shattered rock, but its trajectory was undeniable. It was heading for the exact point of vulnerability the chief engineer had just identified. Alara's prediction was unfolding in real time. The choice was made. "Commander Thorn," Rostova said, her voice ringing with the clarion call of absolute command, "stand down." Thorn stared at her, his mouth agape. "Captain. You can't be serious." "I am the captain of this ship, Liam," she said, her use of his first name a deliberate, final severing of their professional alignment in this moment. "Your counsel is noted and dismissed." "I said, stand down." She turned her back on him, a clear and public signal that the debate was over. She faced Alara. "Officer Vance, you have the tactical station. You have command of the main phaser array." A ripple of shock went through the bridge crew. The captain was vesting ultimate control of their primary weapon, their last hope, in the hands of the most junior officer in the room. It was an unprecedented act, a shattering of protocol so profound it felt like the world had been turned on its axis. Alara simply nodded, her focus absolute. "I need all remaining power diverted to the forward phaser emitters, including life support and inertial dampeners that will leave us dead in the space, and the crew will be thrown by the recoil." Thorn protested, his voice now pleading. "It is the only way to generate a beam coherent enough to hold its shape through the ricochet, Commander," Alara stated without looking at him. Rostova didn't hesitate. "Engineering," you heard the officer. "Divert all available power to the forward phasers on my mark. All hands, brace for weapon discharge and inertial shift." The order was relayed throughout the dying ship. Lights dimmed further on the bridge as power was shunted away, leaving them in a deep, ominous twilight lit only by the red glow of the emergency alerts and the cool blue light of the tactical console where Alara worked. The low hum of the ship's systems fell silent, replaced by the high-pitched whine of the phaser coils charging to a level far beyond their standard safety limits. The silence on the bridge was now absolute. Every person stood frozen, bracing themselves against their consoles, their eyes locked on the unassuming young woman who held their lives in her hands. Thorn stood apart, his arms crossed, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, humiliation, and a sliver of terrified hope he would never admit to. Alara's hands flew across the controls, inputting the final, impossibly complex firing solution. She wasn't just a technician anymore, she was a virtuoso, and the tactical console was her instrument. She adjusted for the gravitational lensing of a nearby protostar, the particle density of the debris cloud, the faint magnetic signature of the target asteroid. It was 1,000 variables, all calculated and synthesized in a matter of seconds. "Phasers are at maximum charge," she announced, her voice the only sound in the silent room. "Firing solution is locked." She looked to the captain. Rostova gave a single, sharp nod. "Take the shot, officer." Part 6, 886 words. Alara drew a single, steadying breath. The world narrowed to the glowing console under her fingertips, and the elegant, deadly arc of her calculation on the holographic display. The weight of 400 lives, the fate of the Odyssey, the culmination of her entire life, the lonely nights studying star charts on her dusty homeworld, the dismissive sneers at the Academy, the 2 years of invisible servitude in her corner, it all converged on this single, defining moment. There was no fear. There was only the problem and its solution. Her finger hovered over the firing stud. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, clear, and resonated with a certainty that seemed to hold the very ship together. Firing, she pressed the stud. The Odyssey screamed. With all power diverted to the weapon, the inertial dampeners were offline. The recoil from the phaser discharge was titanic, a physical blow that slammed through the ship's frame. The deck plates buckled and groaned. The entire bridge was thrown sideways, and crew members who weren't securely braced were tossed like dolls. A brilliant, impossibly bright lance of pure white energy erupted from the forward phaser array. It was not the wide beam of a standard attack, but a focused, needle-thin spear of light, so intense it seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of space itself. It streaked across the void, not towards the debris cloud where the Wraith was hidden, but towards the designated pivot point, asteroid Alpha 4. For a heart-stopping second, it looked as if she had missed completely. The beam was heading for empty space, destined to dissipate harmlessly into the nebula. Thorn let out a choked sound, a mixture of despair and vindictive, "I told you so," but then, the impossible happened. As the beam neared the massive asteroid, it did not impact. Instead, it bent. The magnetic field of the iron-rich asteroid acted like a cosmic lens, catching the coherent energy and warping its trajectory. The spear of light curved in a graceful, perfect arc, disappearing behind the dense cloud of rock and dust that shielded the Wraith from view. Silence. The beam was gone. Nothing happened. The bridge was frozen in a moment of agonizing suspense. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ping of the hull breach alarm, a lonely heartbeat in the void. 1 second passed. 2. 3. It felt like an eternity. Thorn began to shake his head, a bitter smile of failure touching his lips. They had wasted their last shot. They were dead. And then, a light bloomed from within the debris cloud. It was not the quick flash of a weapon impact. It was a silent, swelling star of incandescent fire. It grew rapidly, consuming the dust and rock, turning the entire cloud into a miniature sun. From the heart of that fire, the silhouette of the Wraith could be seen, not in one piece, but in 1,000 pieces, its frame ripped apart from the inside out. Ilara's beam, arriving at the precise nanosecond her calculations had predicted, had struck the pirate ship's exposed engine core just as it emerged from its slingshot maneuver. The resulting warp core breach was instantaneous and catastrophic. The pirate ship, the Phantom that had haunted them for weeks, was vaporized in a silent, beautiful, and utterly final explosion. The light from the detonation washed over the bridge of the Odyssey, a cleansing wave that seemed to sweep away the smoke, the fear, and the despair. The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of suspense but the silence of awe. The crew picked themselves up, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, and stared at the view screen. They looked at the fading fireball where their enemy had been, and then, as one, they turned to look at Ilara Vance. She stood at the tactical station, her hand still resting near the firing stud. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, and a fine tremor ran through her body. She looked small again, unassuming, almost lost behind the massive console. But no one saw a ghost anymore. They saw a giant. The spell was broken by a single, whooping cheer from the helmsman. It was immediately followed by another, and then another, until the entire bridge erupted in a wave of raw, exultant relief. They had survived. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. Commander Thorn did not cheer. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the remnants of the Wraith. He replayed the sequence in his mind, the impossible prediction, the insane ricochet, the perfect, final result. He looked at Ilara, at the quiet competence that he had mistaken for meekness, at the brilliant mind he had tried so hard to silence. The foundations of his world, of protocol, of hierarchy, of the inherent superiority of his own judgment, had been shattered as completely as the pirate ship. Everything he thought he knew was wrong. And the proof was a dissipating cloud of gas and debris on the view screen. Part 7, 918 words. In the aftermath of the explosion, a new kind of order settled over the bridge. The frantic energy of survival was replaced by the focused, purposeful activity of recovery. Damage control teams were reporting in, engineering was working to restore primary power, and the crew, buoyed by their impossible victory, worked with a renewed sense of hope and camaraderie. The alarms were silenced one by one, and the harsh red emergency lighting gave way to the steady, reassuring glow of the main power grid coming back online. Through it all, Alara remained at the tactical station, quietly monitoring the sensor readings, ensuring there were no other threats in the nebula. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a scene from someone else's life. The cheers of her crewmates felt distant, their congratulatory glances failing to fully penetrate the bubble of focus she had wrapped around herself. Commander Thorne approached her slowly, his steps hesitant. The usual arrogance in his posture was gone, replaced by a stooped weariness. He stopped beside her, not looking at her, but at the screen displaying the lingering energy signature of the Wraith's demise. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence between them was thick with the weight of his earlier words, his public humiliation of her, his catastrophic error in judgment. How, he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. It was not a demand for a tactical explanation. It was a question of profound personal bewilderment. He was asking how she, a junior officer from a forgotten colony, could see something that he, with all his training and experience, had missed. Alara finally turned to look at him. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so," there was only a quiet, empathetic sadness. "You looked at the data and saw what the textbook told you to see, Commander," she said, her voice soft. "You saw a cornered enemy. I saw a hunter setting a trap. We were looking at the same information, but we were reading it in different languages." Her words were not an accusation. They were a simple, devastatingly accurate diagnosis of his failure. It wasn't a failure of intelligence, but a failure of perspective. His rigid adherence to protocol had become a set of blinders, preventing him from seeing the truth that was right in front of him. He had been so focused on following the map that he had failed to see the cliff edge it was leading him toward. He finally met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw the crumbling of a lifetime of certainty. "I was wrong," he said, the admission costing him more than any battlefield defeat ever could. "I was wrong, and my pride nearly cost us everything. I am sorry, Officer Vance." The apology was choked, difficult but utterly sincere. It was the sound of a man being broken down, and perhaps, being rebuilt into something better. Before Alara could respond, Captain Rostova joined them. She placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Alara's shoulder. The simple gesture was a powerful statement, a public anointing. It declared to the entire bridge that this was not just a lucky rookie, this was a hero. "You did more than just save this ship, Alara," Rostova said, using her first name for the first time. The informal address was another seismic shift in the established order. "You reminded us all of a lesson we had forgotten." She looked around the bridge, her gaze sweeping over her crew, lingering for a moment on Thorne. True strength isn't found in rank, or in protocol, or in the blind execution of orders. It is found in the courage to see the truth, no matter how inconvenient, and the conviction to speak it, no matter the cost. She squeezed Alara's shoulder gently. "You didn't just see the numbers. You saw what was behind them. You saw the intent. You saw the pattern in the chaos. That is not a skill that can be taught at the academy. It is a gift." The bridge crew listened, their expressions rapt. This was more than a post-battle debriefing, it was a redefinition of their core values. The rigid hierarchy that had governed their lives had been proven fallible, and in its place, a new, more profound principle was being established, the principle of merit. Talent, insight, and courage were what truly mattered, not the pips on one's collar or the pedigree of one's birth. The ship, though battered and broken, felt more whole than it had before the battle. The invisible walls between ranks and divisions had become porous, replaced by a shared sense of respect and awe for the young woman who had saved them. The ghost from the corner had become the heart of the ship. Part 8, 876 words. Later, after the immediate crisis had passed, and the Odyssey was limping towards the nearest starbase for repairs, Captain Rostova summoned Alara to her ready room. The chamber was a stark contrast to the chaotic bridge. It was quiet, orderly, and filled with artifacts from Rostova's long and storied career. A model of her first command sat on a shelf, next to a ceremonial Klingon dagger, and a framed commendation from the Federation Council. It was a room that radiated authority and history. Alara entered with a newfound, albeit hesitant, confidence. She still wore the same ill-fitting uniform, but she wore it differently now. She stood taller, her gaze direct. Rostova was seated behind her large desk, but she gestured for Ilara to take the seat opposite her, a chair usually reserved for visiting admirals and ambassadors. The official report will state that the Wraith was destroyed due to a brilliantly executed, unorthodox tactical maneuver, Rostova began, her voice formal. It will highlight the exemplary performance of the entire bridge crew under extreme pressure. She paused, her eyes locking with Ilara's. But you and I and everyone on that bridge will know the truth. The official report will be a masterpiece of understatement. She leaned forward, her professional demeanor softening. I have already sent my preliminary report to Fleet Command. In it, I have recommended you for the Star Cross, the highest honor for valor in combat. But that is not why I called you here. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small, velvet box. She slid it across the polished surface of the desk. I have also submitted a formal request for a change in my command staff. Ilara looked at the box, then back at the captain, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. I am creating a new position, Rostova continued. Special Tactical Advisor to the Captain. This officer will report directly to me. They will have full access to all sensor and tactical data, and their role will be to analyze our strategies, to challenge our assumptions, to be the voice that looks for the patterns everyone else misses. To see the traps before we fall into them. She gestured to the box. The position requires the rank of lieutenant. Congratulations on your promotion, Lieutenant Vance. Ilara stared at the box, speechless. She slowly reached out and opened it. Inside, nestled on the black velvet, were the two gleaming pips of a lieutenant's rank. It was more than a promotion, it was a validation of everything she was. It was a statement that her unique way of seeing the world was not a flaw to be suppressed, but a strength to be celebrated. Captain. I don't know what to say, she stammered, overwhelmed with emotion. Say you accept, Rostova said with a small smile. I need you, Ilara. This ship needs you. The old ways, the rigid thinking that Commander Thorn embodied. It almost destroyed us. We survived because you were willing to break the rules. I need that perspective by my side, not hidden away in a corner. The mention of Thorn brought a shadow of concern to Ilara's face. What about the commander? Rostova's smile faded. Commander Thorn has submitted his formal resignation from his post. He requested a transfer to a teaching position at the academy. In his letter, she picked up a data slate from her desk. He stated that he believes he has more to learn than he has to teach, and that his first lesson will be on the dangers of pride and the importance of listening to every voice, regardless of rank. It was a stunning act of humility from a man who had seemed incapable of it. He had not been broken by his failure, but transformed by it. He had chosen the path of redemption, ensuring that future generations of officers would learn from his mistake. The culture of the Odyssey was already changing, from the top down. The invisible lines of prejudice and hierarchy that had defined life on the ship were being erased. Crew members now greeted Ilara in the corridors with genuine smiles and nods of respect. Junior officers spoke up more in briefings, their ideas met not with dismissal but with consideration. The ship had been damaged, but its spirit was being reforged, made stronger and more resilient. Ilara looked down at the rank pips in her hand. They were not just symbols of a new position. They were symbols of a new philosophy, a new hope. They represented the idea that a single voice, armed with truth and courage, could change the course of a battle, the culture of a ship, and the future of everyone on board. She closed the box, a new sense of purpose settling over her. I accept, Captain, she said, her voice clear and strong. Thank you. Part 9, 856 words. Ilara Vance reminded an entire crew, from the highest-ranking officer to the newest recruit, that true strength isn't found in a rulebook. It isn't measured by the rank on your collar or the prestige of your family name. It is found in the quiet, unshakable courage to see what others miss, and the profound conviction to act on that truth, even when every voice of authority tells you to stand down, to stay silent, to know your place. Her story is a testament to the power of a single, determined voice to break through the noise of doubt and dogma. She proved that the most critical insights often come from the most unexpected places, from the people we are trained to overlook, the ones working diligently in the corners of our world. Her single, impossible shot did more than destroy an enemy ship, it shattered a flawed system of belief. It tore down the walls of arrogance and replaced them with bridges of humility and respect. Captain Rostova was reminded that true leadership is not about enforcing blind obedience, but about fostering an environment where every voice has the potential to be the one that saves you. Commander Thorne learned the hardest lesson of all, that pride is a fatal poison, and that true strength lies in the ability to admit when you are wrong and to learn from those you once dismissed. The crew of the Odyssey was reborn in the fire of that battle, emerging not just as survivors, but as believers in a new way of thinking, a way that values insight over status and courage over conformity. Think about your own life. How many times have you held back an idea, silenced a concern, or swallowed a truth because you felt you didn't have the rank, the authority, or the right to speak up? How many potential solutions have been lost, how many disasters have gone averted, because the person with the answer was told to stand down? Ilara's story is a challenge to all of us. It urges us to listen more carefully to the quiet voices, to look for the hidden gems in our own lives, the colleagues, the friends, the family members whose wisdom we may have overlooked. And if you are that person, the one with the unique perspective, the one who sees the pattern in the chaos, do not let anyone silence you. Your voice has power. Your insight is valuable. Your courage to speak up can be the single factor that turns a hopeless situation into a triumphant victory. Never ever let anyone tell you to stand down when you know, deep in your gut, that you hold the key. Your voice, your truth, has the power to change everything. Who in your life needs to hear that their perspective matters? Who needs to be reminded that their courage to speak is their greatest strength? Share this story with them. Remind them that the most important shots, the ones that truly change the world, are almost always the ones that no one else believes you can take. Part 10, 576 words.